Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you for the pipes as well. I was just saying to Gordon on the way in, I once learnt to try and play the bagpipes. Both my grandmas are Scottish, and so I sort of felt it would be a nice thing to do until I started playing them, and then I decided that it might break our family forever. So I haven't played them since. So part of the reason I'm here this evening, as Sarah mentioned, is because of my connection with Gordon Brown, who I was lucky enough to work with during his period as Prime Minister. I remember getting draft speeches from him on international development, which was the topic that I worked on. He had a tendency to work on these in the early mornings. They'd be full of intellectual rigor, passion, insight, but to put it mildly, the form often needed some polishing. Gordon's approach to typing was somewhat creative, more directional than specific, and colleagues used to joke that he was writing in Serbo-Croat. I learnt Serbo-Croat, and I have to say that was much easier to decipher than Gordon's typing. Secondly, the style itself required some work. That was fair enough. He was a busy guy. I'd often scroll down to the bottom of his speeches just to see how they were unfolding, and the last paragraph tended to be something like, "And 26thly, I would like to say." I learned a lot from my time working for Gordon, and that includes my approach to speeches. Luckily for you, I don't have the same intellectual capacity as Gordon, so tonight I'm just going to talk about 9 things that we need to do to tackle extremism. So as Sarah said, I've been working to counter extremism and hatred for a long time before it attacked my own family. That journey began when I was 18, and I went to the former Yugoslavia in the immediate aftermath of the conflict there. I worked with children who had survived the siege of Sarajevo. And for the next 10 years, I spent every summer and every Christmas running holiday camps, volunteering in orphanages, teaching in schools. I worked with children from Mostar, from Vukovar, and most distressingly from Srebrenica, all of whom had had their lives, their families, and their futures destroyed by ethnic and religious hatred. For me, it was a huge formative experience. I remember the horrific screams at night of kids whose nightmares felt more real to them than real life. I remember the kids who hardly spoke and those who would flinch whenever there was a loud bang. One of the messages that meant the most to me after Joe was killed was a very simple Facebook message from one of the kids who I'd worked with since they were a toddler. It simply said that you and Joe were there for us, and now we are here for you and your children. From that early experience, I spent a lot of my life thinking about what I can do to tackle the hatred that scarred the lives of so many. I've worked with charities and campaign groups, as Sarah mentioned, on civil wars and genocides in countries as diverse as Sudan and Rwanda, Bosnia and Syria. Joe and I worked on these causes together. She came to Bosnia and Croatia with me, where kids I'd known for a decade call her Yo and thought she was a Wonder Woman. She threw herself in the game so much so that chasing 14-year-old kids one evening in a game of it, she ran straight into a tree and nearly knocked herself out. We travelled together when Joe was working for Oxfam to different conflicts and worked together to push for action to address them. At that stage of our lives, Joe and I focused our work internationally because we felt that the underpinnings of our own democracy and our own rights were secure. There were, of course, huge issues of social justice in Western societies, but we felt at the time that the fundamental underpinnings of liberalism were well anchored, and therefore our efforts were best directed overseas. A few years ago, both Joe and I started to question that assumption. Joe first. It wasn't any one single factor, but the rising hate crime, the growth of the far right, and the European response to the refugee crisis were all elements in our thinking. So knowing that our first responsibility was always to where we lived, we thought and worried more about the UK and Europe than we had ever had before. Joe as a candidate for MP and then as a Member of Parliament, and I as a campaigner and researcher. I've now spent the last year and a half trying to understand rising extremism across Europe, looking at its origins, the dynamics of public opinion, and most importantly, what we could do about it. I've spent time in France, Germany, Holland, Italy, Poland, Netherlands, Slovakia, and the US, among others, spoken to academics, politicians, civil society, and campaigners. The 9 points I'm going to outline now are some of my thoughts to date. They aren't exhaustive, none of them are polished, and if anyone can think of a 10th point, that would be very helpful just to take it to a round number. So the first piece is encouragement for us all to take it seriously. For too long we've been complacent, assuming that rising support for the far right was just a blip, a protest vote, or limited to a couple of countries. Even now, in the face of incontrovertible evidence that something more fundamental is happening, we try to reassure ourselves that things are as they were. We've got to the absurd position of celebrating fascists coming second in national elections rather than first, as if that's a great outcome. I'm not suggesting that we'll become defeatist, but unless we're clear about the size and scale of the challenge, we will be defeated by it. We have to realise that there's no automatic break in society, nothing that stops us coming off the tracks. Our values and our institutions are only as strong as the public support for them, and each generation has to fight for them. Secondly, call it what it is. Populism is too kind a term. In fact, in most countries, these groups we refer to as populists are in fact consistently unpopular. While many have been growing in size, in most countries they don't represent more than 20% of voters, and only in Hungary do they represent more than half. In the rare cases where they do win elections, they have tended to do so on a minority of the vote. More importantly, the people who lead these movements are not populists. They're racists, they're xenophobes, they're bigots, intent on tearing our communities apart. And until we call them what they are, we'll lull people into a false sense of security and play down the hatred that drives them. Thirdly, we mustn't assume that this is about a specific group, and if only we could assuage concerns about that group, for example, if people just understood Islam, that things would be different. The front line of extremism shifts over place and over time. In the UK at the moment, the group most targeted might be migrants. 10 years ago, it might have been Black Britons. In Germany, it's hatred towards refugees. In the Netherlands, it's about Islam. In France, it's French citizens originally from Algeria. In Poland, it's Jews as much as Muslims. In America, you can go from Mexicans to Muslims to African Americans in one day. What's clear is it's not really about the characteristics of any of these groups per se. It's about people's perception and reaction to otherness. Fourth, there's no easy policy solution. The concerns with otherness are always there, but they're more potent when they're fed by insecurities. At present, there's a toxic mix of three. Economic insecurity, driven by low wages, increasing cost of living, changes in the economy, globalization, inequality. Secondly, physical insecurity, namely crime, but more especially perceptions of risks and the threat of Islamist terror attacks. And thirdly, identity, challenged by immigration, changing high streets, cultural change. As a matter of public policy, we have to address all three of these insecurities, but we mustn't kid ourselves that they'll go away. So alongside this approach, we need a community-wide attempt to build more inclusive communities and to tackle the fear of the other. Fifth, to counter the threat of extremism, we have to unite as a community. What's happened in recent years is not that societies have become less tolerant. In fact, most are steadily becoming more so. The problem is that the far-right voices, who make up a tiny minority, have become better organised and more vocal. They've positioned themselves as the silent majority when they are neither silent nor a majority. They've dominated the debate, not through winning people over, but by organising and shouting loudest. Meanwhile, the pro-diversity, pro-tolerance side of the argument is just diffuse and split into silos. Many of you will know Pastor Niemoller's poem. If not, I'll read it. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. These words are not just poetry, they're a desperate cry for us to learn the lessons of the 1930s, and a strategic plea for us to bring communities together, to fight the attacks upon each of us as if they were an attack on us all. Sixth, we have to try to reach out to people who are anxious. I know people who have concerns about things like immigration, the pace of change, but they also have empathy and a belief in inclusion. They're good people who worry about their community. Too often, people, especially on the left of politics, see everyone who doesn't agree with them as deplorables, and that's a huge mistake. The Bush mentality of you're either with us or against us is not one that we should adopt. In the UK, that mistake has too often been made in the way that we talk about Brexit. The vast, vast majority of people who voted for Brexit weren't driven by racism or bigotry. They voted for Brexit for completely legitimate reasons, whether or not you agree with them. To align their support for Brexit with support for intolerance and bigotry does them a disservice, is untrue, and is much more likely to drive them into the arms of extremists. The problem at the moment is that no one is consistently engaging with those most anxious groups. Sections of the left actively alienate them by talking about open borders, looking like they're ashamed of their country. Meanwhile, the right refuses to talk about growing inequality and economic insecurity. These people feel like they have nowhere to go. Seventh, we should talk unashamedly about what makes our country a great place to live. It was something Jo did instinctively. She was proud to be from Yorkshire, proud to be English, proud to be British. She saw no tension between that layered identity and having an inclusive view of her community and an interest and openness to the world. Because there is no tension. For too long, we've let the far right wave the flag, and it's time that we took it back from them. To talk about the things that make our country great and the things that together make us who we are. We should also make it clear that the far right are no patriots. They support a foreign ideology that many of our grandparents died to defeat. They're often supported by the security apparatus of the Russian state. As the judge said in the trial of the person who killed Jo, it was she who was the true patriot. He was no such thing. Eighth, a core part of this is to talk about what we have in common, not to fixate on what divides us. In the aftermath of Jo's death, the phrase more in common, taken from her maiden speech, has been popularised. At its core is a simple insight that we spend too much time talking about what divides us and not enough about what brings us together. For example, we spend huge amounts of media space talking about referenda and elections and too little about the things that unite us. Liberal audiences make the same mistake. They emphasise and celebrate diversity and difference when it's even more important to talk about the things that bring us together, sameness, commonality. Ninthly, and lastly, and most importantly, the best way of defeating extremism, in my view, is to work locally, to build closer communities. We all long to live in close communities. We worry about not knowing our neighbours like we used to. We'd like our kids to be able to pop round and play with their friends instead of liking each other's Facebook posts. Jo's politics started with her sense of community. They came from her granddad, Arthur, who was a postman. He knew everybody and would walk for hours with Jo, pushing her around in her pram. Her empathy and belief in community came from getting out and talking to people. And it's my belief that if we all did that a little bit more, we'd all be happier, safer, and live in more inclusive communities. So that's where I'm most focused. To remember Jo, on the 17th and 18th of June this year, we're asking everybody to do something very simple. To get together with their neighbours, to share food with their neighbours, and celebrate what we have in common. We hope that this moment, as well as remembering Jo, will start to bring communities closer together, to make connections between us that we can build on. I hope many of you here will take part in what we're calling the Great Get Together. And there's a website, this is the advert bit of it, thegreatgettogether.org, greatgettogether.org, which has all of the information if you do want to get involved. So to conclude, the threat of the far right and rising extremism is real, and it isn't going to go away quickly. But with resolution, a concerted attempt to reach out, and a focus on building closer communities, we can and we will defeat it. In one of her last speeches to Parliament, Jo quoted from Edmund Burke, "The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men and women to do nothing." That would be her call to action, and I hope it will become ours. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Brendan, for that amazing speech, a declaration of what you intend to do in the future, a statement of your belief in community and your determination to build a better society, not just in Britain, but around the world. You also were very humorous as you started by explaining my speech technique. It is true that one of my university lecturers wrote in one of my essays, "You have finally proved to me that typing can be as illegible as writing." And Brendan knew and knows what that means. You know, this has been a very important part of our foundation event, to remember Jo Cox and to have with us Brendan, who is keeping her memory alive, but working with thousands, I believe hundreds of thousands of people around the country for this huge event that will take place only a few months from now, and which she announced the details of. I remember talking to Jo on one occasion, and she told me that she was, as Brendan described, a working class girl from Yorkshire who managed to get, by her great abilities, to Cambridge University. But she didn't feel at home at Cambridge, she didn't feel welcomed by Cambridge, and she went away thinking that university was not for her. And it took her some time, she said, to re-establish her confidence after being at Cambridge. And you can understand all the pressures on a young life. But she said she then decided that she was not trying to join the establishment, she was trying to change it. And she gained confidence from the fact that throughout the next stage of her life, she was doing amazing things, working on a maternal mortality campaign that dramatically reduced the numbers of mothers who were dying in childbirth, and that was a great achievement of Jo to lead that campaign. Working on so many other campaigns, most recently on Syria, to speak up for the refugees there when nobody else was doing so. And I was touched when I found that in her last moments, Jo, she was trying to protect her own staff when she herself was so fatally wounded. And that was Jo Cox, an amazing woman who we will never forget. And Brendan, I want you to know that the people of Kirkcaldy, the people of Fife, and the people of Scotland not only share your grief, but want to ensure that everything that Jo has done will be remembered, and it will inspire us to do more in the future. And Brendan, you are yourself a brilliant campaigner. I know that because I've worked with you. You've pushed me to do things. You have been a tremendous energy, a force for making international development issues come alive with the British public and making people in Britain think more about our responsibilities, our duties, our obligations to people in other countries. And I want to say to you, we will support your campaign. We will support your efforts to bring unity, to bring friendship, to bring comradeship, where people are immigrants into our country, to stop the prejudice and the discrimination that is practiced against refugees and other people, to make sure that we do what Jo and you have given all your time to do, to build a better society in this country and a better society around the world. Brendan, you have all our support. I know you're writing a book on Jo's life that will come out soon, and I hope everybody will feel able to buy that book when it comes out. I know you're organizing these great events in the next few months that will remember Jo's life, and we are there to support you in your future campaigns. We are there with you in spirit, and we will be with you in practice. Please thank Brendan Cox for an amazing lecture that he's given us this evening. Thank you very much.